Good morning, everyone. I think we'll wait another minute so people can join. All right. So good morning once again, and welcome to this webinar. We are very honored today to welcome Camilla Vleugaard as our guest speaker. My name is Henk Sikstra, and I am the chair of the Management Expert Group of Eurosite. And for those who are not familiar with Eurosite, Eurosite is a network organization of site management organizations and individuals interested in nature conservation and site management. Eurosite's mission is connecting competence in conservation. And in practice, this means that we are supporting site managers by sharing knowledge through webinars, study tours, networking and projects to improve their skills and competences. The Management Expert Group is one of the working groups active within Eurosite, and the topics we as a working group are focusing on include, among others, climate change adaptation, stakeholder involvement, management effectiveness, and nature restoration. If you are interested to join Eurosite or one of the working groups, please contact us through info@eurosite.org. We will show that address also at the end of this webinar. In today's webinar, we will focus on the impacts of year-round grazing of large herbivores on structures and functions of areas based on research that was carried out by Camilla and her team at Aarhus University. Camilla is a senior researcher and head of biodiversity section, Ecoscience at Aarhus University. Her research focuses on processes on terrestrial biodiversity, with a particular emphasis on large herbivores, ecosystem processes, and evidence-based nature management. She also works as an advisor to the Danish authorities on biodiversity and nature management. Now, there are some housekeeping rules with which you will know by now. So, your audio and video are disabled. Please submit questions through the Q&A function. You can do that at any time, but we will answer the questions, hopefully all of your questions, at the end of Camilla's presentation. The webinar is being recorded, and we estimate that we have 1 hour for the presentation and for the answering the questions. So we are very happy to be with now 132 participants in this webinar. So the subject, Camilla, which you will present, has caused a lot of interest. So we're very much looking forward to hear your presentation and see and hear your presentation. So Camilla, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much for the introduction, Henk. I will share the presentation here. All right. Are you seeing the presentation, Henk? Can you tell me if it's all right before I go on?
Yeah,
all right.
I can see it.
Thank you. Yeah, so this is research partly based on a research project that was funded by the 15th of June Foundation in Denmark, where we looked into sort of trying to quantify or describe scientific baselines to be able to also suggest practical targets for how to restore grazing in ecosystems. Um, uh, I don't seem to be able to change the screen. Just a second. There we go.
Yeah.
So a lot of this work is based on this evolutionary baseline perception that the biodiversity that we are looking at in Europe today, the species interactions, the ecosystems, are outcome of millions of years of development. And what has characterized this million-year long evolution is the presence of large herbivores, mega herbivores, and large mammals in general in these ecosystems. So for 20 million years or so, we've had this continuity in ecosystems with the large mammals. And in the last 100,000 years or so, we've seen a huge downsizing and trophic downgrading of ecosystems. And what you see here this is a representation of that, where you have this long continuity of ecosystems with a diverse community of large mammals, and then the present here at the dashed line, where we have these rather degraded ecosystems. So what we're looking into here is how can we restore these ecosystems when we look into the future. And just to give you an idea of what these ecosystems look like, this is an illustration of recent work led by Simon Krzyzewski. And this is where we looked into pollen and fossil data, and also made inferences from the habitat affinity and environmental affinity of species, indicator species. And these representations were made by an artist. So 10 million years ago and 3 million years ago, you can see these ecosystems that were characterized by these mega herbivores, different species of elephants and rhinos, and this is for temperate European ecosystems. And what you notice here is also that there is a very sort of open structure in these wooded or forested ecosystems. So we don't have a very dense closed forest that is often perceived as sort of the climax vegetation, but a forest and open grasslands that were in a mosaic together. And I'm not that good at species names in English, but I think you might already here recognize some of the species we also find in our nature today in Europe. If we move on to the last interglacial, about 130,000 years ago, we see again, we recognize a lot of the plants and small mammals, but when it comes to the larger mammals, they have disappeared in our ecosystems today. But still these open woodlands, grassland woodland mosaic. The last interglacial is more open because the climate was colder, it was less productive, but there were still some of these large mammals present. And then for a period after the last interglacial, we actually had a period with quite closed forests until humans in Europe started to really impact the ecosystem by cutting down trees, And you see here sort of that in the Mesolithic, this more sort of dense vegetation structure. And you can also see that the mega herbivores, the elephants and rhinos, are gone in this time period. And then the last illustration shows this pre-industrial, very extensive agriculture, maybe around 200 years ago, 300 years ago in Europe. And you see again this open woodland habitat that is sustained by agricultural practices. You see the farmer putting his animals out in the meadows for grazing, and for a period of time, this has really sustained biodiversity and sustained many of the habitats that were formed by this evolutionary baseline. And I think this is also why we have such a strong perception of the importance of agriculture in maintaining biodiversity in Europe. But it's also a little bit shifting baseline syndrome that we are looking into sort of the very short or most recent history of European nature and ecosystems, and maybe missing this whole evolutionary history. And it's very important when we think about restoring ecosystems and how we manage ecosystems in the future, that we really understand the processes that shape this biodiversity, and how do we restore that so that it can shape and maintain biodiversity in the future. These are just some pictures from Denmark, but I think they might be quite illustrative. So there is a challenge in still sort of in this idea that agriculture can maintain biodiversity, agricultural practices can maintain biodiversity, because I think there's a very sort of romantic perception of agriculture, and in reality, it very rarely is practiced in this way, as you see here in this pre-industrial landscape. So this, for instance, is nature management in Denmark. This is a farmer who is paid to graze these meadows. But the animals here are only here in the ecosystem for quite a short period of time during the summer. What you might not see here is that the fence line is actually right over in the background by the trees. So the animals are not allowed into the forest. And that means it's impossible to recreate this open woodland mosaic. Instead, the meadows are often overused in the summer period, and that means that insects are having a hard time. And you can also see that it's very grass-dominated vegetation, not a lot of flowers. So it definitely has some challenges. And I would say another really big challenge in European ecosystems is sort of the opposite. All the nature areas where there is no farming going on that are abandoned. This picture is recent. It's a bit foggy. It was a morning walk. I went on and I took this picture. It's a river valley, or it's a creek that runs here, and it has been grazed maybe 10 years ago or so, but it has been abandoned. And now you can see all the litter accumulating, and you have very strong grass dominance and tall herbs, which is not beneficial for biodiversity either. And if we then look into where have all the wild animals gone, all the leftover from this downsizing of the mammal fauna in Europe, we often find them here in the cultural landscape. So this is red deer grazing in a field. And I think it's also a little bit of a curiosity that we refer to the red deer as the king of the forest. But when we used to have elephants that were kings of the forest, so it illustrates really this how our minds shifted to the current state where red deer are the large animals in the landscape. So also, I think what's sort of a shift in how we manage nature areas, but also especially when we restore nature areas, is that many of you are probably used to working with biodiversity targets for species, targets for habitat types, as we know it, for instance, from the Habitats Directive. But when we restore ecosystems, it's also about the processes. So we need targets that we can for natural processes, so that we can follow up and find out whether we also deliver on ecosystem processes, because it's such a big part of the integrity of ecosystems. And I use natural quite often, natural grazing, natural baselines, and sometimes people ask me, what do you mean by naturalness? Because it can have such different meaning to different people. But in this case, it's really the degree to which ecosystem structure and dynamics are regulated by ecosystem processes rather than human management. So for grazing, it's about the animals and the density and the interaction between animals being regulated by the ecosystem itself, rather than by humans regulating the animals. And what we wanted to do with this study or this project was to provide a clear reference for large herbivore biomass and the size composition of animals in the system, and to help managers assess how far they are in their management in the current situation. How far are they from natural conditions? And we also wanted to translate these scientific baselines into more practical restoration targets, because we know that there are current restraints to land use. There can be legal, like animal welfare constraints, that makes it difficult to do sort of a full ecosystem restoration in the sense of large mammals in these nature areas. So in that way, we can support practical decisions on stocking levels, on which species to reintroduce, grazing regimes, and how to regulate the populations. And hopefully that will also improve the transparency in the project decision or the management decision process, and increasing the comparability of different projects. So to give you some of the numbers, I will start with the natural biomass. So in most biomes and across trophic levels, we often find this consumer-producer relationship. So it's quite simple. I would say that if there is more to eat, there are more consumers in an ecosystem. So for large herbivores, we would expect that there is a relationship between the primary productivity of the ecosystem and the biomass of large herbivores, illustrated by this very simplified figure. So we went looking for this in the data, and we found a data set with 100 biomass from 130 different sites around the world. And that's what you see here on the y-axis, and you just pay a little bit attention to the logarithmic scale of the y-axis. And then on the x-axis, you have the productivity of the ecosystem. It's measured here by a remote sensing measure that measures the greenness of the ecosystem as a proxy for the productivity. And we have divided the data points into the different ecosystems. So what you can notice here is that the African ecosystems, the orange line, we find a nice significant relationship between the ecosystem productivity and the biomass of the large herbivores. And it's also quite high. And for most other continents, we don't find this relationship. It's non-significant, and in some cases, it's even negative. For North America, we do find a significant relationship, but as you can see here with the logarithmic scale, it's very low in general, the biomass of large herbivores in North America. So because we also in Africa know that Africa is one of the few continents where we still have a very diverse composition of these large and mega herbivores, and given that we also find this relationship that we would expect based on producer and consumer relationship, we believe that it's fair to assume that African ecosystems can act as the most sort of near natural ecosystems that we have at the present. So looking at it from a different angle, I have plotted here the African PAs, that's the African protected areas, as the second column, and the third column is the data from European rewilding sites, so the biomass of large herbivores in European rewilding sites. And I think what really struck me when I looked into this data is how low the biomass of large herbivores are in European protected areas. So the data from these protected areas are from national parks in Germany, in Italy, in Spain, nature reserves in Sweden, and so on. So they really have a very low biomass of large herbivores. But if we look into European rewilding sites, you can see that they actually have an even higher biomass than in the African ecosystems. And I think it's mostly explained by the fact that many of these rewilding sites are in more productive ecosystems. And the last column is our estimates of biomass from Eurasian paleoecological studies, and some of these are also from quite low productive ecosystems during cold periods. So, but overall, you can see that the African protected areas, the rewilding sites, and also the paleo data shows that we would expect there to be many more animals in protected areas than there are currently. And I just want to add to this that what characterizes European rewilding or grazing in European rewilding sites is that it is year-round grazing. The animals are left in the ecosystem all through winter. There has been a focus on reintroducing some of the bigger animals like cattle, horses, and bison, in addition to red deer, fallow deer, and roe deer, for instance. And the densities are close to carrying capacity, but I think it's also worth mentioning that nowhere in Europe are the animals, to my knowledge, allowed to just live, reproduce, eat, and die. So there are always humans involved in the decision when animals should be allowed to die. So there is some kind of regulating mechanism but still it's reproducing this quite high biomass of large herbivores. The take-home messages from this is that, yeah, like I said, biomass of large herbivores in many protected areas is much lower than this natural baseline. Rewilding projects seem to restore the natural biomass of large herbivores. And then I want to mention here that for nature management in Denmark, for the past 5 years or so, we have recommended using a range from 7 to 25,000 kilograms per square kilometer, based on some case study areas that we have in Denmark, and it seems to hold in the sense that it is possible to practice year-round grazing without supplementary feeding at densities within this range for ecosystems in Denmark. Of course, there are some ecosystems that are very low productive, like the dunes we have along the coast, where it might be even lower. But of course, there are always exceptions to these things. Another thing we worked on is how big, because as I mentioned, we have really seen a downsizing of the mammal fauna. So at the last interglacial, you can see here the different types of mega herbivores with rhinos and elephant, but even the horse and aurochs have been removed from the ecosystems. So what we have now are a much smaller collection of mammals, fewer different species, but they're also very small in body size compared to the natural baseline. But I wanted to know how is the size distribution in the biome, or how is the biomass distributed across these size classes of mammals? So I took the data from before and divided it into small herbivores under 100 kilograms, meso herbivores between 100 and 500 kilograms, large herbivores between 500 and 1,000, and mega herbivores weighing more than 1,000. And then I looked into what is the percentage of animals in these different size classes. And you can see here for the African ecosystems that the small herbivores, which in European ecosystems would be like roe deer, fallow deer, red deer, wild boar, they actually make up only about 10% of the total biomass. The rest of the biomass is almost equally distributed between these larger categories of species, larger categories of herbivores. And when we look at prehistorical data, we actually see a similar size distribution. So it seems that this is sort of the natural size distribution, is that the smallest herbivores also make up the smallest percentage of the total biomass. And again, I think this is really an eye-opener when we look into European ecosystems today, where many ecosystems not only have a very low biomass, but they are completely dominated by the smallest of these herbivores. So how do we translate this natural baseline into restoration targets where you can sort of move towards improving herbivore-mediated processes? And that's what we mean by partial restoration. It's an approximation of these herbivore-mediated processes, taking into account that there may be for different reasons you cannot do a full ecosystem restoration. So the core idea is that even though it's not possible to do a full natural ecosystem restoration, you can still obtain substantial ecological gains, biodiversity gains, by adjusting the herbivore biomass, the body size structure, the trophic interactions, and also the spatial heterogeneity of the area. And the last two points here, they are included in this study, and I will mention them shortly, but I don't have time to give you all the details on that. So for the natural herbivore biomass, how can you approach that? So the best you can do, if possible. So all of these are like, if possible, you should do this. Alternatively, you can do this and this and this. But if possible, you should aim towards a natural biomass range by having self-regulating populations. So the animals should be reintroduced into the ecosystem. They should be able to reproduce and live in the ecosystem, find the resources that they need, and also be allowed to die in the ecosystem as an integrated part of the ecosystem. We know that there are, I think, in almost all European countries, there are restrictions because we now view these animals like the one you see here in the picture, this Highland cattle. It's viewed as a domestic cattle. So you have to live up to the legislation that is used for domestic animals. So that means in many cases you are not allowed to just let the animals die in the ecosystem. So instead you can practice reactive management, and what that means is that you keep an eye out for your animals. You look if they start to show signs of not thriving, of starvation or other health issues in the way they behave or in their physique, then you can take the animals out, remove them from the area, or cull them. So that is one way of doing it. And that way you are letting the population increase to the carrying capacity. And when the animals are showing now they are close to the carrying capacity, you regulate only the individuals that are showing a sign of starving. And in that way, you will have a density of herbivores that is very close to the carrying capacity. Of course, it has to be year-round herbivory. The animals have to be outside the whole time. And you can allow population fluctuations instead of a fixed stocking level. And of course, avoid supplementary feeding. Alternatively, if it's not possible to do this reactive management, you can do a proactive population management. And I think this is what we see in many places where in many sites where they practice this sort of rewilding, extensive grazing, whole year-round grazing, is that the managers get very experienced with the areas and their productivity and with the animals and their needs. And then they will proactively, so ahead of time, they will reduce the population just below the carrying capacity so that they avoid animals showing signs of starvation. And the last thing you can do is that you can set a site-specific biomass target. So in case you don't want to have reproducing animals, or you don't want to have a lot of management decisions about regulation, you can have site-specific biomass targets. So you decide a target between what we estimate the range to be for temperate ecosystems, between 5 and 20,000 kilograms per square kilometer. Of course, if it's a very productive Central European ecosystem, it might be higher. If it includes old fields, it might be higher. If it's very unproductive, it might be slightly lower. But this is one way of doing it. Then how do you increase the body size structure of trophic complexity? Of course, in many rewilding projects in Europe, there is a focus on reintroducing more of the larger herbivores. So reintroducing bison, for instance, and introducing these Taurus cattle that are larger than other of the extensive cattle breeds. So you can really prioritize this because we also still see some projects where and national parks where the largest animals is the red deer. So key recommendation is to prioritize the larger herbivores. The larger, the better. And it would be really exciting to see a European project with mega herbivores. But you can think about increasing functional diversity and not just the number of species. So if you already have grazers, think about reintroducing browsers or the other way around. Wild boar for rooting. And we know there's also differences between breeds and even populations of horses, for example, whether they will eat bark off trees or not. So you can think about reintroducing animals that have these qualities. And you should really try and avoid communities dominated by the small herbivores, small and meso herbivores only. And where possible, we know that predation actually supports this shift from small herbivores to larger herbivores. So if you have the species present and you have herbivores in the ecosystem, they will mainly target and regulate the smaller herbivores, meaning that there will be more primary productivity for the larger herbivores and they will increase in numbers. And that's how you create this shift so that most of the biomass in the ecosystem is on the larger species rather than the smaller species. Yeah, and in cases where predators are absent, you should think about selectively reducing small and meso herbivores. So we know from Oostvaardersplassen, this Dutch rewilding site, it used to be managed with reactive management of the animals, so they were allowed to reproduce. But there was no predator in the ecosystem. So we really see an increase of the small herbivores, the red deer in this case, and for instance, the cattle was actually decreasing in that ecosystem. And if we compare to a reintroduction of wolves in Yellowstone, we see a shift there that when you reintroduce wolves, it regulates the red deer, the North American red deer, and bison increases. So this is a really important process also in the ecosystem for supporting this dynamic between the small and large herbivores. It's important because large herbivores really drive disturbances in the ecosystem. They create structural heterogeneity and they redistribute nutrients in a whole different way and a different scale than the small herbivores do. And it's also important because we know from a previous study that small herbivores actually tend to have a negative impact on plant species richness, whereas the larger species have a more positive or increased plant diversity. So it's really important to think about if you have ecosystems dominated by small herbivores, that they might actually be driving biodiversity degradation. Of course, when you're working with ecosystem restoration and natural processes, they demand a lot of space. So it's important to increase the area available to the herbivores, also for them to find fodder during different periods of the year. So you can look into expanding reserves, so you can have also the larger reserves you have, the more different species are possible to coexist in the area. Of course, the animals drive vegetation dynamics, but you can also help it along by restoring wetlands so that herbivory can act together with natural hydrology. As I mentioned before, it's really important to think about open habitat and forests not as two separate habitats, but think of them as one where the animals move across and they become more of a mosaic. Because we know a lot of the biodiversity in Europe is connected to these semi-open habitats. Yeah, and if you have very homogeneous nature areas, think about restoring some of the structural variation so that the animals have a variation to feed on and so on. So just the final take-home messages. I think there is a huge potential for improving herbivore-mediated processes in European ecosystems. And partial restoration is not partial because it's a failure. It's really a path for ecosystem restoration, and it's a path for moving forward in the right direction. And the way we wanted to structure this framework is also so that there is transparency about what is the natural baseline, what is sort of the very long-term target of ecosystem restoration, and how do we move in that direction, giving our current ambition or the current feasibility to restore these ecosystems. And I want to leave this slide, but of course, I also have to give thanks to all the people who contributed many good thoughts and data to this work. So thanks for listening in, and I hope there are many good questions.
Thank you, Camilla. Yeah, that was a very interesting presentation, and yeah, it is, let's say, a very straightforward and clear approach to mainly, I would say, nature restoration. So it links very much with the rewilding and nature restoration principles.
Yeah, but can I just say to that, Henk, that we are also working with farmers here in Denmark, and we're also giving advice to the agricultural agency in Denmark that are making these subsidies you can apply for as a farmer. And I think even having that sort of range in your head, for Denmark, we're using this 7,000 to 25,000 kilograms per square kilometer. It's even useful for farmers, and we see farmers shifting from seasonal grazing to whole year or year-round grazing, and then looking into this range. And I think that's also a huge improvement because it used to, it could have been, or it can be even tenfold the grazing pressure in agricultural practices. So even having this range can also improve how we do, how farmers graze our nature areas.
Okay, sounds interesting. Well, there are questions, especially Bill Grayson has been very active in asking a number of questions. And Bill, I don't think we can go into all of them, but maybe, and that's maybe also a bit more general, is his question is, some systems here in the UK comprise a network of separate nature reserves. So management includes the option to moving animals between different sites according to various impacts needed. This is another way of allowing them to remain outdoors year-round in a self-sustaining way. How do you look at that? Because, of course, there are different areas. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, so this is a good question because I think that is an issue in many places that you have areas that are too small to have grazing animals in that small area year round. So you have to move them, and sometimes we see people moving them in this. I think they call it holistic grazing. So they don't move them until it's completely eaten up in one fence, then they move them to the next fence. And it almost has the same effect of mowing if you're removing all the vegetation biomass by the grazing animals and then you move them. So I think you have to. It's not an easy thing how to do this, but you could again you could try and use this framework where you say the long term the long term target here is to have grazing animals in these nature areas where they can choose themselves where they roam. And then you can have partial targets, maybe to try and connect these areas by corridors or increase the area in general. And maybe that's not doable. So maybe these such small areas where it's not possible to increase the size, maybe we just have to say it's not doable to restore grazing there.
Yeah. So here's another question from an anonymous attendee, but still relevant. I'm a bit surprised, as we often hear that small animals should be favored over large animals to prevent trampling in natural grasslands and wetlands. Do these recommendations apply to livestock farming or only to the introduction of wild animals as part of rewilding?
I don't know where that comes from. I would say that the scientific literature is showing that the small animals have a negative impact on the plant diversity. It's related to the width of their mouth. They are more selective in what they feed on, so they can have a more negative impact on the ecosystem. Whereas the larger the animals are, the more bulk they take in. And we've also seen in another study we did recently that especially the grazing pressure during the winter or the dormant season of plants increases the plant diversity. And I think that both has to do with grazing, but definitely also the trampling has a positive effect during the dormant season of plants. So I think it's an artifact that this statement that small animals are better than large animals. I don't think it's supported by science.
Yeah, but there are many questions, and I don't know, Sophia. Sophia is helping us with the webinar, whether we can allow one or two persons to give them the microphone, because otherwise I need to read long pieces of text. Sophia, is that possible?
Yeah, sure. I think if you just let me know who.
For instance, I would like to give Quinn Jones the microphone.
Okay, just a second.
Quinn,
Okay,
are you there?
I am here. I am here.
Yeah, you wrote a long piece of text, which
Yeah,
is
okay.
very relevant, but maybe you can ask the question yourself.
Okay, I also made a comment actually that I'm really missing the comment section here. It would be good to have that live in the next event, I think.
Yeah.
But two questions I had. The first was maybe a bit flippant, but some of this seems to me to be a Danish traditions question, really. That there's no reason why the fence should be at the edge of the forest. You know, there's no reason. Yeah, different things which are not necessarily something that has to be associated with farming, let's say, but which has become so in Danish tradition or Danish regulation or Danish perceptions of what's good or whatever. So is there a less purist halfway house where we just change those things rather than having to have something completely different? That's one question. And the second question is, we're talking about a feedback mechanism here. And as I understand feedback mechanisms, you can get all sorts of loops happening. So you can have cycles emerging, or more commonly, you can have chaotic responses, just like with the weather, can't you, emerging? Whereas your theory or your way of looking at things seems to be that there is an equilibrium, and that the animals should be at this equilibrium level, and that if they go beyond that and you maybe you cull them or you let them die off or whatever, but that there's an equilibrium. And I'm not seeing where this comes from a scientific perspective. And wouldn't a chaotic system, let's say, give you more variation and more spaces in your ecosystem? Thank you.
Thanks, Gwen. So just to the first question, it is maybe sorry, I'm trying to make a note for your second question. I might have to ask you about that again. But to the first question, maybe it is only a Danish law, but we're not allowed to in Denmark. You're not allowed to graze in the forest. In Denmark, it's a law, but I think in Europe, it's a productivity question. Also, if you want to have a timber that is useful, it's not good to have grazing animals in the forest that basically ruin the trees for timber purposes. So even though it might not be the law in other countries, I think it's still the practice to keep the animals out of the forest. In this evolutionary perspective, it doesn't make sense to separate it in that way. But of course, if you're restoring ecosystems, then you also shouldn't produce timber in those ecosystems, but the wood should be left in the ecosystem. So it's just how do you say, a point to be aware of, that when we restore ecosystems, that we do it across open habitats and forests. So that was one thing. And then the other thing was about this equilibrium and feedback. And I think maybe you misunderstood, because the carrying capacity will fluctuate. And if you are managing your herbivores in response to the carrying capacity of the ecosystem, it will fluctuate over time. And of course, in some of the rewilding sites, we see an increase in woody species. We see an increase in bushes and trees, and maybe that at least to some point supports feeding of the animals. But when of course, when the trees become too high, it might actually mean that the productivity for the animals decreases, and then we will also see a decrease in the population. So I think in this evolutionary perspective, these dynamics have been going on over hundreds and thousands of years, and also in space. So some places will grow into more dense forests, whereas other patches will be restored or become open as a result of fire or flooding, for instance. So this dynamic will have been going on over time and space in the natural baseline. So when we see these rather small rewilding sites becoming more dominated by woody vegetation, I think it's partly also because we're missing the really big herbivores from these ecosystems that could sort of roll back some of this woody vegetation and keep it in check. But I think it's that's also what's curious about these things, and something that a question that we still have to answer. How is this dynamic between the vegetation and the herbivores? There are many things that we don't know about that yet.
Okay, thank you. I'll take another question from Mike Delcourt. When you suggest to restore spatial heterogeneity, do you mean we should do it with human intervention before reintroducing large herbivores, or reintroducing large herbivores is sufficient to increase this heterogeneity?
So I think humans have been very efficient in modifying most landscapes in Europe. So if a site is drained, or if you have a forest where trees have been planted in a plantation with trees in straight lines, I think it makes sense to do a human intervention to sort of kick off the restoration process, maybe removing some of these trees, removing the ditches or drain pipes in the wetlands to sort of kickstart this process. So of course you could have done a similar thing for restoring hydrology, restoring coastal processes, coastal flooding, where you could have defined or described the scientific targets and these partial restoration targets. So I think in many aspects there are several things to be done to restore ecosystems, but I think it's important that it's done together with animals, or you restore the ecosystems and then you introduce the animals, so they have a chance of doing what they do in the ecosystem.
Yeah. So there's another question from Ryan Campbell. Why shouldn't selective timber harvest not be possible, basically, in combination with grazing? Because I know, for instance, that in southeastern Europe, along the Sava River, for instance, pig grazing and oak harvesting is combined for a very long time. So you have pig grazing in oak forests as a very traditional way of also managing these oak forests. So his question is basically there should not be.
So I think it depends on what other targets you have for this nature area, and if it's a protected site, of course, depends on what level of protection it has, but it might not be beneficial, or it probably won't be beneficial for biodiversity to remove woody biomass from the ecosystem, because there are also a lot of habitats in dead and decaying wood and veteran trees and so on. I don't know the specific area, but of course, like I said, there are some of these very traditional, very extensive management practices that support biodiversity and have done so in the absence of large herbivores. So this practice of cutting the oak might simulate an elephant in that ecosystem. But so it depends on what is the protection, if you can have a production in an area or not. Yeah, I don't know if that answered the question somewhat.
I think it does, Camilla. So maybe one last question, because it's 12 and there's really a lot of questions. But do you think, it's from Ben Lebas, do you think non-fence colors are positive in context of the wider herbivory?
Yeah, so I think there are advantages and disadvantages. So in some places, fencing, a physical fence, is not it's just not feasible, or yeah. So in that case, it might be a better choice to have the no fence solution with the, and for other people listening, it's these collars that give a signal to the animal if they are crossing a virtual line in the landscape, basically keeping them within a certain area. I think it means that you have to handle the animals, so to put the collar on the animals. So in that way, you will have, if we're thinking of rewilding, then having to handle the animals means that they have to somehow be used to animals, for you to be able to interact with them. And in that sense, it might have a negative impact on how they behave, and also how they behave towards people who are walking, taking a walk in the area, if they are coming up to them, or if they are staying away from them. And then also, I think for humans visiting nature areas, if you cross a fence, if you walk into a fence, you are aware that you are with horses or cattle. So, but if you are crossing this virtual line, and the signs are not clear, then you might not know that there could be a horse or a bull waiting around the corner. So I think it is something to think about when you use these solutions. Yeah.
Yeah. All right. It's past 12 now. I think we should stop. And I'm looking at all the questions that we cannot deal with now. So probably we will send a link of the recording to all those who participated, but also all those who registered but could not participate. And maybe we can include to answer some of the questions in the message we are sending around. I'm looking at you, Camilla, whether you have the time to do that. So we can come back on that. Yeah. So we'll keep the questions for the moment, and hope to send more information related to these questions when we send around the link of the recording. So Camilla, thanks a lot for your presentation. It was really, really very interesting.
And thanks for listening in.
And for all those who, indeed, who listened and who attended this webinar. So hope you enjoyed the webinar and that you are pleased with the information that Camilla gave us. For now, I wish you a very good week, and thank you once again, and we'll keep you updated for upcoming webinars on these topics. So thank you and bye-bye.
Bye.